from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I'm pleased to welcome you back to our special series that we've been doing titled Journey Through 20th Century America. On today's program, we're very fortunate to have three people from the past, very famous people in history, and as we do this, what we call Chautauqua format, we're very pleased to have them here. Before I introduce them, I want to once again thank the Idaho Humanities Council for a grant that's made our series at North Idaho College, including the television programs, possible, along with local funding, and we thank the council very much. First of all, I'd like to welcome to our program from the past Georgia O'Keeffe, who was a famous American painter who lived from 1887 to 1986. Ms. O'Keeffe, welcome to our time in the year 2000, and we look forward to interviewing you in a few minutes. We're very pleased to have as our second guest, Frances Perkins was the first woman to ever serve in the United States Cabinet of the President. She lived from 1882 to 1965 and was the Secretary of Labor during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. Ms. Perkins, welcome to our program. And our third guest today comes to us as a famous photographer who was particularly known for her work in Vietnam. She lived from 1919 until 1965, Dickie Chapelle. In fact, Ms. Chapelle lost her life during the Vietnam War. Welcome to our program, Ms. Chapelle.
Oh, pleased to be here. May I smoke?
I'm afraid that's not possible here at this time. I know that was one of the things that you like doing very much, but if you can just control yourself for 30 minutes, you can have a cigarette after the program.
Thank you.
As always, I'm very pleased to have our panel. First of all, is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle, you have the pleasure once again of welcoming and questioning our distinguished guest.
As Tony noted, each one of you was a very famous person during your time. And can you tell us what you would most like us to remember you by? What do you consider your most significant contributions? Let's start with you, Georgia.
Well, in 1926, I had a conversation with Sherwood Anderson. And I told Sherwood Anderson that I felt the important thing, or the thing, was to make your unknown known. And I'm not sure that I accomplished that, but I was an artist who kept pace with my time and made paintings within my time. And so I would say that my most important contribution is that I made paintings so that people could see what I saw. And so perhaps they could feel what I felt when they looked at my work. The work was from my perspective, my way of seeing, and that was my focus. That was my intent.
What about you, Frances Perkins? What were some of your most significant contributions?
I feel that my most significant contributions were the pieces of legislation that I authored during the New Deal administration, most notably the Fair Labor Standards Act, which guaranteed maximum working hours in a week and a minimum wage for American workers. And then most importantly, the thing that I believe really accomplished the most for the American people was the Social Security Act.
Did men listen to you in your time? Did you have any concern when you were the only woman in the cabinet?
I did.
That you were being listened to?
Actually, I didn't speak in my first cabinet meeting because I was so nervous that I thought they would think me a silly female that was just running on. And my friend Eleanor Roosevelt once said that the members of Congress thought it was funny for my first 2 years to have me come down about twice a week and testify at some hearing. But in later days, they did begin to respect me. John L. Lewis became a very staunch fan, and I think that meant the most to me, that someone who worked so hard for the common worker would think that my work was important.
And Dickie, what about you? What were your significant contributions?
Well, Janelle, I'd like to share with it. My most significant contribution is that I'm a darn good photographer. I'm as good as Margaret Bork White. I want this opportunity to just state that. And not only that, not only am I a good photographer, I take pictures where most people won't go, and that's men and women both. I would say that I've sent a message to women that they can go out into battlefields, take pictures, take photographs, and come back with a significant document of some of the most trying times we've gone through. Women can do this as well as men. That's my contribution.
Steve Sheen.
If you'll forgive my saying so, you are three very, very notable people in American history, but not, with the possible exception of Ms. O'Keeffe, not exactly household names. And I think there are others in our audience, certainly, who, like I, are less than adequate historians. So I wonder if I could ask each of you, maybe starting with Ms. Chapelle, to tell us a little bit about your life, a little bit more about, and briefly, about your background and how you came to your professions.
Frankly, I came to my profession because I wasn't good for much of anything else. I grew up in a household in Milwaukee, Wisconsin of 12 people. There were women all over the place, aunts, grandmothers, my mother. They performed all of the domestic chores. To this day, I can't cook, I can't sew, I can't do any of those things. I was a very good student, though, in high school. In fact, I went to MIT on a scholarship. I was in aeronautical engineering at MIT. But I liked flying. I would hang out at the local airfield. I flunked out of MIT. I wanted to fly. I went back home. I was a halfway decent writer. I'd written a couple of pieces for some local newspapers and started to concentrate on that. And when I got a job with TWA in New York, and this was in the late 30s, I met my husband then, Tony. Tony was a photographer. He was the one who taught me how to take pictures. And I was always, I suppose you might call me a tomboy. I grew up following my father around. He was the one who told me I could do anything I wanted to do, and by gosh, that's exactly what I've done. So I got my first taste of war photography during World War II. I took pictures of Marines fighting on Iwo Jima in Guam, and from there I started covering hotspots. I took pictures during the Hungarian Revolt, 1956. Got thrown into a Hungarian prison, a jail, for 52 days. Then after that little foray, I was in Cuba in 1958, following Fidel Castro, around for 3 weeks out in the hills of Cuba. I went from there to Vietnam. I've done 5 tours of duty in Vietnam, taking photographs and writing articles. I started out because I learned 2 things I enjoyed doing, and that's what I've been following ever since.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Perkins, briefly, your history.
I was born in Boston to a very traditional, at the time, middle-class New England family. They expected me to grow up to be a wife and mother, and I really didn't have inclinations against that. I went to Mount Holyoke because I didn't know what else to do, and I'd had a lot of fun with my friends in high school, and I thought that I would continue my social activities, but I had an advisor there who refused to let me drop the upper division classes. So I went from there to 2 frustrating years at home and then to a teaching job in Chicago, and that is where my life really started to change because I met Jane Addams and started working at Hull House. And I decided to pursue my master's in philanthropy, which is now social work, and I went to New York. After I received my master's, I was working for the Industrial Commission when I witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1919, in which 146 mostly teenage women were killed because the owners had locked them into the building so they couldn't leave during their shift. From that time on, despite the hardships that it brought to my personal life, my marriage, and my role as a mother, I could not stop trying to work for the betterment of the working people, especially women who suffered even more under the hands of the factory owners. So I started serving under Al Smith on the New York Industrial Commission, and when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became governor, continued that, and that is where I made the connections that brought me to the White House.
Thank you very much. Ms. O'Keeffe?
I was born in 1887 and died in 1986. And to talk about my life as an artist, I guess I would start with the autobiography, which is really a book about my paintings, which was written in the 70s, the 1970s. And my first recollection of knowing what I wanted to do would be with a conversation that I had when I was 12 years old with my friend, Lena Burkholz, and I mentioned to her that I wanted to be an artist when I grew up. And that took shape. I went to a number of different institutions. I suppose the first stronghold in that was having one of my teachers, a nun, tell me that the hand that I made was too small. When I struggled over this, I was certain that in the future I would make sure that everything was large. And perhaps that was an influence in the way that I painted later. And other influences in my life included William Merritt Chase and Arthur Wesley Dow. Chase for his feelings of wanting to indicate to artists, painters, that they should get a sensation in their work, and Arthur Wesley Dow about a new way of thinking. And beyond that, and I ended up marrying Alfred Stieglitz, which is very significant in my life, as he was a major art impresario and owned Gallery 291 and brought major artists to the United States, including Cézanne and Picasso and George Braque. And so I became one of the artists in his gallery, as well as marrying the man. And he was adamant about the fact that I should paint and not have a child. And he liked what I did, and I liked what he did. And so I was a major working artist all of my life. And so I was fortunate that I made art my entire life until I could no longer see. And even at that point, when I was an older woman and I had the care of I was cared for by Juan Hamilton, who was a much younger man. And of course, there are many stories that are associated with that. But anyway, he kept me in touch with clay and three-dimensional forms, and he was a clay artist himself. And so I was an artist through my whole life, and yes, I was well-known, and I was well-known before I died. And that is something that is significant for artists, because especially being a woman and being recognized and known before you're dead is unusual.
Doesn't always happen that way.
No.
Thank you very much.
I have a question for each of you about your accomplishments, and I'll start with you, Miss O'Keefe. Your work, as you've indicated, has certainly been recognized worldwide, and you've been admired very much, and you are very famous, and you were even in your lifetime. But there are always critics. There are those who praise and those who criticize. How would you respond to those individuals who claim that in all your work they saw a specific message that dealt with sexuality, even in your flowers and so forth? As an artist, were you bothered by the fact that the people tried to interpret your work for you, or how would you react to some of those comments?
Well, I would say that if people saw sexual symbols in my work, they were talking about themselves. They weren't talking about me. They were looking at themselves. And until the day I died, that's what I said. But there has been significant debate about that.
In addition to that, in relation to your works, what were you most proud of in your accomplishments? You certainly produced a tremendous amount of work, and you lived a very long life, I believe, at age 99. What are you most pleased about that people have said about your work, or what would you like for them to remember about your work?
I would like for people to remember that my work was made because that's what I saw, and those were the images that I was interested in. I didn't make images to ascribe to a certain way of working, to align with a particular school.
You had a lot of freedom in your work.
I had a lot of freedom because I had time and I was afforded a lot of opportunities. I don't believe I recognized that a lot during my life. I was also very sensitive to working very hard, and I had occasionally I had breakdowns and I had difficulty with things, but I was always a working artist, and that is a privilege to be a working artist.
Thank you. Ms. Perkins, and again, you were breaking barriers, being the first woman in the cabinet. That or other parts of your life, my question to you would be, what was one of the greatest challenges, one of the greatest problems or disappointments that you had? You've already listed on the program remarkable domestic programs that you were very involved in, that still in the year 2000 is really a vital part of our society and serves the people. But what was most difficult for you?
Well, there was one significant professional difficulty and then a significant personal difficulty. And the professional frustration was that after years of working for the Social Security Act and bringing women like Julia Abbott and Grace Lathrop to the Children's Bureau under the Department of Labor, who'd been working so long for children's rights, that the largest allotment of money in the Social Security Act at the time, which was for aid to families with dependent children, was not given to the Department of Labor. They created another Social Security Administration to be operated separately from the Department of Labor. They put a man in charge of it, and then they put them in our offices so that we could train them. And that was a frustration to me, and it was very heartbreaking because it did take care for children out of the hands of the women who had been fighting for it for so long. And I think my personal difficulty and frustration was that my entire life people wanted to know about my private life. I could never be a politician in this world of 2000 I see today, or a bureaucrat, because it was very important to me to keep my private life private, and I resented the prying of various people who wanted to know about things that were not their business.
Thank you. Ms. Chapelle, the same question to you. What was one of your greatest disappointments?
One of my greatest disappointments, I believe, was not probably receiving the recognition that I thought my work deserved, quite frankly. I would say one of the most difficult, we want to carry with the question what was my most difficult thing I faced, was simply for 20 years going out and being shot at by people I couldn't see. I mean, I didn't think that I was going to live as long as I did in my profession. And fear was something I had to conquer every time I walked out, on the battlefield following the Marines. 4 times in Vietnam, and the 5th time I wasn't so fortunate. But I would say just that was one of my greatest accomplishments, was being able to do that for 20 years. I would say one of my major disappointments was that I saw what was happening in Vietnam long before the U.S. government would recognize what was happening. I took pictures that were confiscated, over 200 photographs that were confiscated by the U.S. government. I know what had happened to the French. I was seeing the U.S. follow the same policy in Vietnam that the French had followed, and it brought them to defeat. I wanted that word to get out, and I had an impossible task in doing that. And I would say that was one of my major disappointments.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Each one of you was a barrier breaker. You broke some barriers for other women. So my question to you is, how do you think your life might have affected those women who came after you? Are you surprised at the depth and the breadth of what women now can do? And let's start with you, Dickie. Are you surprised at what people can do now? Or have they fulfilled what you had hoped?
They've fulfilled what I've hoped. Women especially. I never believed that there were any barriers that I could not overcome. I've never believed that a woman could not do anything that she might choose to do with her life. And I was also very fortunate in that I grew up in a supportive family, a father and a mother who told me, and grandparents and aunts and uncles who told me, anything you want to do, you can do, Dickie. And I think other women were perhaps not as fortunate as myself. But I'm very pleased to see the strides that women have taken, and not terribly surprised.
Now, Ms. Perkins, you started out, you were the very first female cabinet person, and since that time, many women have been cabinet members. Do you think that it was more difficult for you to be the first person?
Frankly, I had doubts about accepting the appointment. If I had not cared so deeply for the Roosevelt family, I may not have taken it. But I was talking to my friend Carrie Chapman Catt at the time, who also worked very hard for women's rights, and I told her that I thought that if I did not step through this door that had been opened for me, that the door may not open the next time. And so I did feel a duty to other women. I must say that I really thought that we'd broken some ground with some of that legislation that would move women's place in the workplace along much faster than it has. And despite the fact that there have been other women cabinet members, women did not get their own restroom on the floor of the Senate until just about 7 years ago, I'm told, which is still rather shocking to me. And I hope that they continue the work to bring women's role in the workplace and in government up to full equality.
Georgia, you were able to paint, and you were given the freedom to paint in part because of your husband, and your work was perhaps recognized in part because of your husband and his role in the galleries. What do you feel today are the kinds of things? Can women artists still be recognized, or do they have to perhaps have someone who's a mentor for them?
Well, I think one of the first things I would say is simplification is important. Perhaps moving aside some of the things so that you can think about your work. And working hard may bring about the chance to be recognized. Give people the focus to pay attention to what they're doing. My lifestyle was very simple. There's a lot of ritual to my lifestyle, the time I got up and the way that I worked, and not a lot of clutter around, and I think that's helpful. As far as do women have the chance to be recognized? Why, yes, but it's a lot of hard work, and there were fewer women recognized in the 19th century than the 20th century, and many more women have been recognized at the end of the 20th century than say the middle of the 20th century. So they have the opportunity, but it's a matter of choices. It is very difficult to have a family and to be a working artist all of your life. It's very difficult to do everything. And in this society where I'm observing as a dead woman now, that emphasis is very different. But there's one more thing I need to talk about, Mr. Stewart. I'd like to bring up this question one more time, this sexual question you brought up.
Yes.
Do you think if I made a painting of a flower 4 inches by 3 inches, that anyone would look at that?
I don't have the answer to that, Ms. O'Keefe. So my whole question was some of the critics and what they'd written about you, and I think you've clearly answered that the individual may be interpreting something for themselves.
Well, and when you make a painting of a flower 3 feet by 4 feet, there are some recognizable images that we find in humans, and we find in animals, and we find in flowers. And that's the way it is.
I think you've answered it very clearly.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, Ms. O'Keefe. Steve Shink.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and I know that Mr. Stewart wants you to get out of character before we're done, but very quickly, Ms. Chapelle, were you a photographer who found her outlet in the news media, or a journalist who told stories through photography?
I would say that I was a journalist who told stories through photography. I was a journalist and a photographer, not a photojournalist, but a journalist and a photographer. And always those two medium went hand in hand. I wrote my stories, and I illustrated my stories, if you will, with my photographs.
Thank you. Ms. Perkins, in your brief autobiographical sketch, it's obvious where your passion came from, but where did your expertise come from? Did you learn on the job, or did you walk into the job as a cabinet secretary well prepared?
I served many, many years on the New York State Industrial Commission, and in addition to a master's degree in social work from Columbia, I also was nearly completed at University of Pennsylvania a master's in business administration. So I did study for many, many long years.
Thank you. And Ms. O'Keefe, I'm a great fan of your work, but I'm afraid I probably have kind of a narrow view. I haven't seen enough of it. what I see is heavily influenced by the Southwest, flowers that have their origin in the desert, other images that are taken from that landscape. What have I missed?
Well, one of the things that I've said is that where and how I have lived is unimportant, but it's what I have done with where I have lived that has been of interest. And so there's a great documentation of how that has happened through the years when you look at paintings that I've made when I lived in New York City. And when Alfred and I lived there, I made many paintings of the New York cityscape, and I made paintings of Lake George. Of course, the male artist felt that my work was bright because I was a woman, and that, well, never mind. Moving on. I also, when I moved to the Southwest, I made not only paintings of churches and bones. Bones were the primary thing that became of interest to me there, but also those flower images began in New York, and leaf images. And these are things that I would pick up and I would use, and I liked them. I lived with those things, and I painted them. And those images were with me through my life. And it isn't just that I liked flowers, but perhaps people think flowers are beautiful, but there are many other things.
On that note, I have to bring the program to a conclusion. I do want our viewers to know who you are and the roles you've played in your 3 employees and great friends here at North Idaho College. First of all is Allie Vogt. She's a member of the faculty teaching in art. She also has administrative duties. And Allie, you've been wonderful, and we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Our second guest has been Julie Taggart-Liegert, who is a member of our staff and faculty in the Human Resources Department. And Julie, I'd like to tell them that you were actually working on your graduate degree about Ms. Perkins, so it surely shows, and as others haven't, how informed you are. And our third guest has been Denise Clark, who's one of the coordinators of the Learning Resources Center at North Idaho College, and also you do a role every year, and others here, such as Allie's done roles before, and so we're delighted to have you here, and thank you very much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this program as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. It's been a delight to have our gifted employees at North Idaho College play famous people in history. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week. We're going to continue for a little bit longer this series that we are running called A Journey Through 20th Century America, when we bring famous people to you in the form of very gifted people here at North Idaho College and in the community. Until next week, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.